Hi, everybody. So obviously we had exam 2 last class on Tuesday. So that means we're halfway down the semester. I've got good news and bad news about that exam. I'll start with the bad news. The bad news is that the scores were a little bit lower than I was hoping in terms of the average score for the class. So the good news is that I'm going to make a small correction to your grade. So what I'm going to do is give an additional 3 points to everybody across the board in the class. Just to boost the average of exam 2 up to where I was aiming for it to be. So what I'm going to do, I'm not going to change that in your top hat grade because that's good. That would require me to do it individually for every student, which is more complex than what I need to do. What I'm going to do is in Canvas, I'm going to create a column. It's going to be something like exam 2 bonus points or something like that. And I'll just give everybody 3 points in that column. That way, at the end of the semester, when I import all the grades from top hat into Canvas, I'll add up all the scores. And so that those 3 bonus points will automatically be taken into consideration, okay? So whatever you got on exam 2, you can mentally add 3 points to that. That's what your actual point total will be, okay? So that's the good news. The other good news is that the exam 2 tends to be the most difficult exam. So exams 3 and 4 people should tend to find them somewhat easier. Okay, which isn't to say they're necessarily easy, but they tend to find them somewhat easier than exam 2. So people's scores generally improve for exams 3 and 4. Okay. Okay, with that out of the way, I mentioned last class that I was going to be giving an assignment this class. I want to talk briefly about what that is. This is an assignment that's going to be due 1 week from today. So next Thursday's class, it's due at 3:30, so at the beginning of this class. And you're going to turn it in by submitting it through Canvas. Okay, so don't email me. You're going to be able to submit it through Canvas. However, you're only going to be able to submit it through 3:30 on Thursday. That's March 11th, I think, right? So if you try to submit it late, Canvas won't let you do that. So make sure you get it in on time at 3:30. You should be able to see the assignment as of now in Canvas. If you go to the assignment section, I have published it and I made it available at 3:30 today. So you should be able to see it right now. I will go over it though in class. So what it's going to be is an assignment on the cognitive dissonance section. So what I'm going to do in just a second is I'm going to show you a short video clip. It's a clip from the show It's Always Sunny in Philadelphia. In the show, there are 4 main characters who own a bar together. And what you're going to see is that this is from, I think, season 1, if there are any fans in here. It's going way back to season 1. So in this clip, what happens is that usually the bar doesn't make a whole lot of money, but for some reason they've noticed that in the past few days, few nights, they've made a lot more money than usual. And they've just come to realize that the reason that is because all of the underage people are coming to their bar because no one has been IDing at their bar. So what this means is they're faced with a bit of a dilemma because they really like the extra money they've been making over the past few nights. But at the same time, it's because of they're allowing underage kids into the bar. So what I want you to do, and actually let me share my screen so you can see this, and I'll show you this video in just 1 second. You have 3 questions I want you to answer, okay? This is going to be worth 10 points total for the assignment. The first question, you're going to see that in this video clip I'm about to show you, the characters, the cognitive dissonance has been created in these characters and they resolve it somehow. And what I want you to do is first off, tell me for 2 points, what caused their cognitive dissonance? And what I mean by that is what 2 elements are dissonant with each other? So what isn't matching with what, okay? That's worth 2 points. The second part of the question, which is worth 4 points, is I want you to tell me how the characters reduced their cognitive dissonance. So if you recall in lecture, we talked about 5 strategies that people have to reduce their dissonance, like changing their behavior, changing their attitude, minimizing the importance of the conflict, etc. So I want you to identify which one of those 5 strategies the characters used to reduce the dissonance. And I want you to explain how they use that strategy. So I don't want you to don't just list the strategy and then define the strategy. That's not going to get you any points. I want you to tell me how did they use that strategy specifically within this context. Okay, that's worth 4 points. And then what I want you to do for the third part of the assignment is give me 2 alternative ways they could have reduced their cognitive dissonance. So of the 5 strategies that are left, you tell me the one that they used, and then you're going to pick any 2 other strategies and tell me for each one how they could have used that within this context to reduce their cognitive dissonance. Okay. With that being said, let me show you this clip. I'm recording this lecture, I'm going to post it on YouTube. So I'll show it right now. And if you need to see it again, you can always access it through YouTube and watch it. Alternatively, if you want, you can always buy it on Amazon for $1.99. And it's probably on some streaming service, I think, somewhere. But let me show you this clip right now. I believe I've set it up so that it should automatically play the audio. If it doesn't play audio, let me know in the chat, but I think it should.
Yeah, but I don't understand how you guys could let this happen.
It was not my fault. I was working behind the bar.
Come on, Dennis. You remember what it was like in high school. The minute that we caught word that a bar wasn't carding, we would just pack the place the following weekend.
They probably had a recon crew come in last week.
Oh, they definitely had a
But
recon.
why, you guys? Why were we not carding? Not my job, dude.
my job either.
Not your. It's all of our jobs. Dude, we could get into a lot of trouble for this.
And we also have a social responsibility to keep teenagers from drinking.
I guess.
Well, I don't know about that, though.
Oh,
Mac.
Mac.
No, wait, hold on. Okay, hold on a second. Hear me out, though. Hear me out. It wasn't that long ago that we were in the same position as these youngsters, right? I mean, we get kicked out of some bar, and what do, Dan? We would get a bunch of 40s from a homeless guy, and we go sit in some park, right?
That is true.
That is true.
Absolutely
and what
true.
would happen? We would almost get raped and or murdered and or stabbed by the crackheads in Fairmount Park.
You want to know what would happen? We drove Nikki Potnick's car into a tree on Kelly Drive.
With Sweet Tea in the back seat, puking all over the headrest because some guy talked to her that she liked. Remember that? Every time some guy talks to you that you like, you get so nervous, you drink yourself into oblivion.
Salad.
You drink yourself
you
crazy.
abused alcohol, and that's okay, but it's very dangerous, right? Right? Okay, well, maybe we should look at this whole thing from a different angle. Maybe we have a social responsibility to provide a safe haven for these kids to be kids. You know, experiment.
No, I don't like where this is heading.
We would have to set up ground rules.
Okay, no drinking and driving. No one's gonna crash Nikki Potnick's car,
Right.
you know? Everyone has to take a cab.
4 drink maximum. Like, that's it. You know what I mean?
Yeah, that's it. Anyone causing trouble can't come. If you're gonna be here, you gotta be cool.
He's gone.
And
gone.
listen, we water down the drinks. Jack up the
Oh,
prices
Mike,
where I can
come
make
on.
a serious profit off these kids.
And they have no idea what the hell's going on. We would actually be doing something good.
Great, I say we do it.
Yeah.
I don't know how you guys live with yourselves.
One day at a time.
One day
One day at a time.
Okay, so as I said, tell me what caused their cognitive dissonance, tell me how they reduced their cognitive dissonance using those 5 strategies I laid out in class, and then give me 2 alternative strategies they could have used to reduce their cognitive dissonance. As I said, that the assignment, the details are all up in the assignment section on Canvas that should be available to you now. I'm only looking for like a couple sentences per each of those sections. You don't need to write like pages in your responses, okay? Remember, that's due 1 week from today at 3:30, turned in through Canvas. And as I said, if you want to see that clip again, feel free to go into YouTube. I'll post it right after this lecture is over. You can see it on YouTube. Okay, with that being said, we're going to move on to a completely new topic now. Let me share my screen again. No, you can submit it anytime up to Thursday at 3. You can submit it anytime. Just make sure it's in before Thursday at 3:30. So for the next couple of weeks, we are going to be talking about what is sometimes considered to be sort of the heart of social psychology. And that's a sub area of social psychology known as social influence. It's in this section, this subsection of social influence, where we're going to be talking about how our behavior is influenced by the presence of other people. That's really the center of social psychology. That's what I mean when I say it's the heart, because that's what social psychologists study. That's what they often define the field social psychology as being, is how we're influenced by the presence of others. So we're going to talk about ways in which our behavior is affected by other people. In particular, we're going to be talking about 4 different types of social influence. So we're going to start today by talking about conformity, which is how we change our behavior in response to what we believe other people are doing. And then we're going to look at other types of social influence, such as persuasion, compliance, and eventually obedience. Now, I'm starting with conformity because, in a sense, this is the weakest form of social influence. And I said this because we will often conform our behavior to match what we think other people are doing, even if those other people aren't putting any pressure on us to do so. Now, sometimes people do put pressure on others to conform, certainly, but we will conform even if other people aren't putting direct pressure on us. And then we're going to see with other types of social influence, we're talking about situations in which people are putting direct pressure on us to change our attitudes or to change our behaviors. So we're starting by talking about sort of kind of the weakest form of social influence. That being said, the tendency to want to conform to other people is extremely powerful, even though it is, in a sense, the weakest form of social influence. And I want to start this lecture by talking a little bit about an infamous day in American history, and not for good reasons. March 16th, 1968. This was during the Vietnam War. And in particular, Charlie Company was in Vietnam, and they had recently lost a couple of well-respected commanders. They'd been killed in combat. And as a consequence, they were looking for revenge on the enemy. They were going to a village called My Lai. And when they arrived there at about 7:30 in the morning, March 16th, they were told that the only people that would be left in the village would be army-aged men, military men, basically, because all the women, children, and elderly would have gone to the markets for the day. However, when they got to this village, My Lai, what they discovered is that, in fact, there were virtually no military-aged men there. In fact, the only people in this village seemed to be women, the elderly, and children, people who were not in the military, just simply civilians. And yet, these American soldiers were so amped up, looking for revenge, that the fact that these people were civilians didn't stop them from burning their huts down, from raping and sexually assaulting the women. They started scalping people. They cut off people's hands. They would throw them down wells. They would throw grenades at them. They would shoot them point blank. There was a photographer that came across the scene. This is called the massacre at My Lai. These are somewhat disturbing images because these are the results of the torture, rape, and murder of civilians at the hands of American soldiers. Okay, and they were murdering infants, right? They were basically not discriminating based on age or gender or anything like that. They were killing all sorts of people. These are some famous pictures of what happened after the massacre at My Lai. And you can see in this case and disturbing images of just dead infants after this massacre. At one point, these American soldiers rounded up a lot of people and put them in a ditch and opened fire on them. These are, again, unarmed people, opened fire on them at basically point blank range. At some points, the women and elderly civilians would throw themselves on top of children to try to protect them. If the children got out and ran away, the American soldiers would shoot them at point blank range. In fact, this massacre went on for quite a while. It wasn't until another American soldier who was flying a helicopter landed his helicopter between the American soldiers who were opening fire on the people who were in the ditch. And he commanded his gunner to open fire on the Americans, on his own men, if they didn't stop killing civilians. At the end of the day, some estimates vary in terms of how many people died, but estimates are between 347 and 504 people. So at the very least, hundreds of people slaughtered, murdered in cold blood by what are supposed to be the good guys, the American soldiers. Okay, a very disturbing incident in American history. When the people who were involved in this massacre were later asked why they did what they did, they said, some of them said the following. One person said this: "You didn't have to look for people to kill. They were just there. I cut their throats, cut off their hands, cut out their tongues, scalped them. I did it. A lot of people were doing it, and I just followed. I just lost all sense of direction." Or the second person who says this: "I killed about 8 people that day. I shot a couple of old men who were running away. I also shot some women and children. I would shoot them as they ran out of huts or tried to hide." Now, The reasons for why this massacre occurred, are going to be very, very complex and certainly beyond the scope of what we could possibly discuss within this lecture. But one aspect that seems to have played a role is conformity. If you look at this first person statement, what they say is a lot of people were doing it and I just followed. I lost all sense of direction, right? In other words, other people were doing it, I just went along with them, right? Obviously, there are many more factors at play that contribute to this behavior than simply conformity, but conformity seems to have been one of a myriad factors that contribute to that massacre. It's important to understand conformity as a consequence, because if we can kill innocent people simply out of conformity, or at least in part because of conformity, we need to study, as social psychologists, the impact that conformity has on people's behavior. So when we talk about conformity, social psychologists usually define it the following way: as a change in beliefs or behaviors as a result of real or imagined group pressure. Okay? A couple things to note here. First off is that in this definition, you can see that in order for conformity to occur, as I mentioned before, there don't have to be people who are expressly trying to get people to conform, right? In other words, conformity can occur even if we change our beliefs or behaviors in response to what we think other people are doing, even if those other people aren't putting any pressure on us to do so. And secondly, another thing to notice is that conformity can occur even as a result of imagined group pressure. In other words, even though just the fact that we think other people are engaging in a behavior might by itself be sufficient to get us to conform to that imagined behavior, even if our beliefs are wrong. That would still count as conformity. How many of us can say that we conform as little as this person here, right? I mean, we like to think that, especially in Western cultures like this one, when I talk about differences between Western and Eastern cultures earlier in the semester, I mentioned that in Western cultures, we like to think that we don't really conform. We like to think that we're individuals. In Eastern cultures, they're much more okay. They're much more accepting of the idea of conformity than we are in Western cultures. That being said, we conform all the time, even in Western cultures, right? The way that you dress, the way that you cut your hair, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, the types of music you listen to, all sorts of things, are all, the way in which we do those things are all in part a function of conforming to what other people are doing, right? That's partly why styles and fads and trends change and shift over the years. So we all tend to conform. Someone mentions, isn't that person conforming to a different standard? So that's an argument too. In fact, you could have people who like to consider themselves non-conformers, but who conform to a different standard. In fact, there was a South Park episode many years ago where I think the boys were joining the goth group. And the goths, they like to say that they don't conform to society, they don't conform. But in order to join their group, this group of non-conformers, you had to listen to the same music they did and dress the same way they did and write the same poetry they write. Right? So they're just conforming to different standards. So you could potentially argue that in some cases. There was an interesting phenomenon that was observed in a study. This is decades back. This is probably in the 50s or 60s when the study was performed. And this study was not looking at the effects of conformity. It was looking at something else. What they were looking at in this study was whether people would sort of just mindlessly go along with the requests of others. And so to test this idea, what a researcher did is they had research assistants, like students, graduate students, say, go to the New York subway and simply go up to a random person who is sitting down and say, "Excuse me, can I have your seat?" And they just wanted to see if people would comply with that. Now, what is sort of interesting, what the researcher sort of, what they observed as an interesting side effect of this process was that the research assistants hated this study. They hated doing this study. In fact, many of them would get physically ill. They'd feel like nauseous prior to having to do this study. And the reason that they felt that way, the reason they got physically ill is because there are specific unwritten rules that exist for how you're supposed to behave on a subway. You don't go up to someone and simply ask them for their seat, right? In order to do that, in order to do the study, they had to break conformity by going against these rules. And this tendency to want to conform to these rules, even these unwritten rules, is so strong that not conforming led them to feel physically ill. Okay, that's part of the reason, although we're going to see there's many more reasons than that, but part of the reason why people conform is because it makes us physically uncomfortable to not conform in many circumstances. Conformity was studied in the early 1900s in social psychology. It was one of the first topics that was really studied in the field. And there's a famous study that was conducted by a guy by the name of Muzafer Sharif that looked at conformity in a sense. He wasn't directly looking at conformity, but effectively, in retrospect, that's effectively what he was looking at. I want to describe to you this study. So here's what he did, okay? So imagine you were a participant in this study. So you show up to his lab, and what you're told is that you're going to be placed in a dark room by yourself. And there's going to be a point of light on the wall. So all you see is this, right? One little point of light in a dark room. And what the researcher tells you is that after a few seconds, this point of light is going to start to move. It could move to the right or the left or whatever. It's going to be randomized. And what your job as the participant is to tell me how far you think that point of light moved. Now, in reality, that point of light never moved. There's an illusion, something called the autokinetic effect. And according to the autokinetic effect, if you're looking at a point of light in a dark room, say, that light will look like it starts to move after a while. It's completely an illusion, but it does look like it starts to move after a while. And so what the researchers did is they simply capitalized on this illusion and asked people how far the point of light moved, even though it didn't actually move at all. So that's what people did on day one. And they did this a few different times. Okay. And then what happened is that on day two, these people came back and they repeated the exact same process again with one exception, which was that they were placed in groups of 3. So there's 3 people sitting in a dark room looking at this point of light. And so after they observed this light for a few seconds, the researcher asks the first person, okay, how far did that point of light move? And they gave a response out loud. Then he asked the second person, how far did that point of light move? And they gave a response out loud. Then he asked the third person. And so if you're the third person in this group, you've already heard 2 people's estimates of how far they think that point of light moved prior to you giving your estimate. And so effectively, what you can look at then is you can see if people's estimates on day 2 of how far this point of light moved, or how far they think that point of light moved, you can see if those estimates start to converge with one another. In other words, you can start to see if people's responses are being influenced by other people's responses, if they're conforming, in other words, to the types of responses other people are giving. And that's effectively what this graph is showing here. So you can imagine they did this with many, many people, but let's just look at these 3 participants. Okay, so this is actual data from the study. So this is participant A in yellow, participant B in red, and participant C in purple. And this pre-group session, this is that first day where they were by themselves. So what you can do is you can look at participant 1, and on average, they tended to estimate that the point of light moved about 7.5 inches. Participant B tended to report that it moved about 2 inches. Participant A reported that it moved about 1 inch. Now, this is all the estimates they gave when they were by themselves, so they didn't hear anybody else's estimates, right? So you can see that they give very different estimates. They're all being affected by the illusion somewhat differently, but they're relatively consistent. So participant A tends to consistently see the point of light move about 7.5 inches, even if you repeat the process multiple times. So then what happens is that on day 2, you get these 3 participants together for group session 1. And now you can look over a series of trials. On average, how far did each participant claim to have seen the light move? And when you do that, what you see, the main thing to take away from this graph is that their estimates start to converge. They start to get closer together, right? So now participant A is saying it's about 4 inches. Participant B is saying about 3 inches. Participant A is saying about 2 inches. And then I didn't explain this, but they came back for a 3rd and a 4th day, what they call group session 2 and group session 3. And what you can see is that over time, they're converging more and more and more until on the 4th day during group session 3, the 3 participants are basically giving the exact same estimates of how far the point of light moved. So in other words, what looks like is happening is that people's estimates are being influenced by the estimates of others. They're conforming their responses to the responses of other people. Now, as I mentioned, Sharif didn't explicitly set out to study conformity within this study. What he explicitly set out to do is to look at how group norms changed, or I guess I should say group norms developed over time. Okay, so in other words, he wanted to see whether within any group of 3 people, there would be this sort of unwritten group norm that would automatically emerge that would then affect how people responded to how far they thought that point of light moved. And so in the example I just showed you, within this one group, the group norm that tended to arise was that they would perceive the light as moving about 2.5 inches. In a different group, they might converge on a different number. It might converge on 5 inches, for instance. But the point is, within a given group, a given norm would emerge that would then affect the responses that people gave. So within each group, people were conforming their responses to the responses of others. And it's not like they were lying. They didn't know that their estimates were being influenced by the estimates that other people had given them. They were simply conforming. They didn't even realize their behavior was being affected by other people, but it was. So this is sometimes considered to be one of the first studies, or maybe the first study, looking at conformity within social psychology. But again, the idea here is that the group norms, the unwritten rules that arose within each group, influence the individual estimates that people were given. Now, this was done in the 1930s. In the 1950s, a researcher by the name of Solomon Asch came along, and he posed a bit of a different question. He was also interested in this tendency that people have to conform. But he realized that in the original Sharif study, where people were estimating how far the point of light moved, that people didn't know they were giving a wrong answer, right? They didn't know, they weren't deliberately conforming their behavior. And so Asch had an idea, and he thought the following: what if you made people choose? What if you put them in a situation where they could either give the correct answer, but to do so, they would have to go against everybody else, or they could conform to other people's answers, but they would have to give a knowingly wrong answer? What would people do? Would people give the right answer, or would they tend to conform to the wrong answer? And so he wanted to set up a situation where the participants in his study knew exactly what the correct answer was and exactly what the wrong answer was. And so that led to what is probably in the top 3 most famous studies in all of social psychology. And I'll walk you through this study. Okay. So again, imagine you're a participant. So you show up for a study and you arrive at a lab. And in this lab, there is a big table. And at the table are seated, I think, 5 other people. And then there's an experimenter. You're the last one to arrive. There's only 1 chair left, so you take the last chair at this table. Now, what the researcher starts explaining is that what he's going to be doing is showing a series of cards. And here's what one of these cards looks like. So he's got a big card about this big that he puts in the front of the room. And on the left is what he calls a standard line. And on the right are what he calls 3 comparison lines. And your job as the participant is to tell the researcher which of these 3 comparison lines is the same length as the standard line. Now, if you just look at this card here, you can see this task is trivially easy, right? Clearly, line B is the same length as the standard line. It's extraordinarily easy. Now, he's got a series of like 10 or 15 of these cards with different lines, but they're all just as easy as this one. Okay, so imagine that he shows this card. And what he does is he starts on one end of the table, and he asks the first person to say which of the comparison lines, A, B, or C, is the same length as the standard line. And the first person says line B. Then he goes to the second person. He goes to the second person and asks the second person, which of these 3 comparison lines is the same length as the standard line? That person says line B. Then he asks the third person and the fourth person. Then he asks you. And then he asks the last person behind you. So basically, everyone gives their response one at a time out loud so everyone else can hear it. And for the first couple of rounds, for the first couple of cards that they show, everything goes as expected, right? Everyone's getting the right answer all the time. And then something weird happens. So right around the 3rd trial, and let's just imagine this is the card that was shown for the 3rd trial. Right around the 3rd trial, he shows this card and he asks the first person, which of these comparison lines is the same length as the standard line? And the first person says line A. And you're sitting there thinking, line A, I mean, what are you talking about? Obviously it's not line A. Like, what a weird response to give, right? Then the experimenter asks the second person, which comparison line is the same length? And the second person says line A. And then he asks the third person, and the third person says line A. And the fourth person says line A. And then he turns to you, which is now, which of these lines is the same length as the standard line? Now, you know it's not line A. You know the correct answer is line B. And so you're faced with a dilemma. Do you give what you know to be the correct answer, which is line B, but to do so, you have to go against everybody else that already gave an answer? Or do you give the answer everyone else gave, which you know to be wrong, which is line A, but at least you're conforming to what everyone else said? Now, if you haven't figured this out yet, you are the only real participant. Okay. So you can see you're always in the second to last spot, the second to last chair. And so the experimenter, who's this guy here, this is the card with the lines on that I was showing you. He always starts on this side of the table, and everybody sitting around this table, except for the one real participant, is working with the experimenter. And they've been instructed to give the exact same incorrect response on certain trials. Okay. So what's really, the experiment that's really being run here is, how are you going to respond, right? You're going to give the right answer, or are you going to conform to what everyone said was the answer, which you know to be false? Now, it's not that everybody conforms, or it's not like any one person conforms all the time. Now, remember that for any given participant, they repeated this procedure like 15 times. And so of those 15 times, like maybe 5 of them, there was a trial in which people gave the same wrong answer, right? It's not that people conform all the time, but rather what happens is that on about 37% of the trials, people conformed. Now, it's not because they didn't know what the right answer was, because they had done some testing ahead of time to make sure that people knew exactly what the right answer was. People knew what the right answer was like 99% of the time, right? So people were knowingly giving a wrong answer about 37% of the time. If you look at the individual participants, because they repeated this process multiple times with each participant, you can see that about 3/4 of the participants conformed at least once. And in other words, 3/4 of people gave a knowingly wrong answer at some point, just because everyone else gave the same wrong answer. And what this suggests is that if I repeated this study, if I didn't tell you of the study, but I set it up so that everybody in the class took part in this, there's about a 3/4 chance that you would also at some point give a knowingly wrong answer, just because strangers gave the same wrong answer. This tells us that we have this tendency to want to conform. All right, so this is what I was mentioning before, where this idea of being a nonconformist can by itself be a type of conforming to a different standard. And this tendency to conform is really strong. And this was done in a Western culture whereby we don't like to think that we conform, right? We like to think that we're individuals. These conformity rates would be even higher if you repeated the study within Eastern cultures, where they're much more likely to conform. So this raises the obvious question, which is, why is it that people are conforming? Why are people caring? I mean, these are people they just met a few minutes ago. Why do they care if they give a different answer than these other people? Well, what social psychologists have learned is that there are really 2 main reasons why people conform. People will first off conform due to what's known as informational influence. Informational influence occurs when we conform our behavior to that of other people's behavior because we assume they must be correct in their judgments. In other words, we think that their behavior contains information as to how we should respond ourselves. And so we conform our behavior to that. That's why it's called informational influence. We are likely to conform for this reason under situations where the correct response is sort of ambiguous, where we don't really know what the correct response is. So for instance, maybe you're traveling in a different country and you don't speak the language, and you're staying at a hotel, and all of a sudden some alarm goes off in the middle of the night, and you don't know, and someone's over a loudspeaker, there's a voice that's saying something in a different language that you don't know what they're saying, right? and you look out your peephole of your door and you see people running towards the exits. Now, chances are you're probably going to run towards the exit as well, and you'd be well justified in doing so, right? You're conforming your behavior to the behavior of others because you assume that them all running to the exits after this alarm goes off contains information as to what you should do, right? That they're correct in their behavior. And so you want to be correct in your behavior as well. And so you're going to conform, right? So the point is that we conform out of informational influence under conditions that are sort of ambiguous as to what the correct response is. So when Solomon Asch, when he talked to participants after he did his study where people were judging the length of lines, some of them said that they thought they had misunderstood the directions. So they thought that when people all started to give the same wrong answer, some people said, well, I thought I might have misunderstood the directions. I thought maybe they wanted me to judge the width of the line, not the length of the line. And so if everyone else was giving the same wrong answer, I assumed I must be the wrong one. They must know better than me. So they conformed to be correct. And under those conditions, those people conformed because of informational influence. So if you take the famous book, The War of the Worlds, which has been made into movies, so you might have seen this with Tom Cruise a number of years ago. The original book was written a long, long time ago. And at one point, this is before television was really a thing, so going back decades and decades, H.G. Wells, famous director, put on a presentation of The War of the Worlds, the book, in a sort of a radio format. And he did something that no one else had really done before. So what he did is, instead of reading a book or giving some sort of regular radio adaptation of the book, what he did is he started off this program, this hour-long program, with just some regular radio broadcasts, like some news broadcasts and some music and things like just some regular stuff, right? And then what happens is, a few minutes into this program, this reporter breaks in and says, we have breaking news. Scientists have just seen explosions on Mars. Stay tuned for more information. And then it goes back to the regular programming of music, things like that. Okay. So the people who are listening, they don't realize that what's being given to them is a fictional account, right? So they just hear that there's explosions on Mars all of a sudden. And a few minutes later, the reporter comes back in over the radio waves again and says, we are on the scene here at this park where a spaceship has recently landed, and we're on the scenes. We've never seen anything like this. And oh my God, the door is opening and some stairs are coming down from the spaceship, and there are aliens that are coming out of the spaceship. And oh my God, they have ray guns and they're shooting people and they're killing people, and it's pandemonium. So if you're one of the listeners to this program and you have no idea this is a fictional account because you've never heard any sort of program like this, right? So you start to wonder, what is happening here? Are we being taken over by aliens at this point? If you are one of these people where you hear this, the first thing we tend to do, this is something I mentioned before in this class, and it's going to come up again in the class as well. The first thing we do when we don't know what the correct behavior is, we look to other people. What are other people doing, right? We sort of saw this when we looked at social comparison theory. When we don't know how to evaluate ourselves, we look to other people. We're going to see it again when we look at persuasion and things like that. So if you're one of these people and you don't know, is this really happening, this alien takeover? You look to other people. You look out your window. And let's say you look out your window and you see your neighbors and they're packing up their car. And you look across the street, you see your other neighbors and they're wrapping wet towels around their face because the aliens apparently have this poison gas that they're releasing into the atmosphere. And you start thinking, wow, everyone else is getting out of town. They're protecting themselves. I better protect myself as well. So you start packing up your car. You start putting wet towels around your face. And now your other neighbor, who's also listening to this program, looks out his window and sees you doing this. And now he sees you packing the car, he starts packing his car. And so what happens is this spreading hysteria starts spreading throughout the city because of this process. And so famously, what happened after this War of the Worlds broadcast is that pandemonium broke out in the city where the aliens apparently landed. People literally started forming posses where they would get shotguns and they were going down to fight off the aliens at this park. Some people opened fire at a water tower. And like this mass hysteria broke out when they did this. And part of the reason why this mass hysteria broke out is because of informational influence. People didn't know what the correct behavior was. They looked to other people to figure out what they should do. If other people were panicking, that meant maybe I should panic as well. And that led to this chain reaction where the next person looks to you and they see you're panicking, so they start panicking, and et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. This mass hysteria breaks out. Okay? So that's conforming due to informational influence. The key here is that the motivation for why people are conforming, if they're conforming due to informational influence, is because they want to be accurate. They want their judgments to be correct. And so we're conforming in order to try to ensure that our behaviors are the correct behaviors to engage in. But this is not the only reason we conform. Social psychologists have identified a second reason why we conform, and this is due to something known as normative influence. Normative influence occurs when we realize that if we don't conform, people are going to think negatively of us. We appear deviant, in other words. Okay? And we know that there are negative social consequences associated with not conforming to other people. And we don't really like those negative social consequences. So we'll conform not because we think other people are correct, but because by conforming, at the very least, we can avoid the negative social consequences of being deviant, of not conforming. This is what Calvin's learning right here. It's sad how some people can't handle a little variety. So he went to school with his pants on his head and his shirt on his legs. And what he's realizing is that by dressing in this way, by not conforming to the standards of society, people don't really like it. There's these negative social repercussions of doing so. And by the way, so this is probably why most people in the ASH study, where they judged the length of lines, this is why most people seem to be conforming, right? In other words, they knew they were giving a wrong answer. Most people did. As I said, some people thought maybe they misunderstood the directions, but most people knew they were giving the wrong answer. And the only reason they were conforming is because they didn't want to stick out. They didn't want to be the only person that was giving a different answer. There would be negative social consequences to that. And they were more interested in keeping peace among everybody and not experiencing those social consequences than they were in being technically accurate. There's a movie that came out in the, I think it's the early 90s, something, it's called The Program. This is a movie where it's about a bunch of football players at college and basically a college football program. And there's a scene early in the movie where the rookie players are being hazed, being initiated, basically. And what happens that they're initiated, or one of the ways in which they're initiated is that all the players go to this highway in the middle of the night and they lie down in the middle of the road along the dotted line on the highway while cars are just whipping by them, right? And it's terrifying to these players, clearly. And it's sort of played for laughs, though, in the movie. If you are to watch the movie now, you won't see that scene, I don't think, unless you get your hands on an old copy. And the reason you won't see that scene is because they took it out after this movie had been playing in the theaters for a couple of weeks. And the reason they took it out is because people started doing this in real life, and some people got killed when they got run over by cars. Now, you might wonder, why on earth would anyone do this in real life, right? Well, you have to imagine that if you get a group of people together, and it's usually men or boys that do this for various reasons. It doesn't speak well, I don't think, on men that we're the ones that do this. But in any case, what happens is you get a bunch of these people that start putting pressure on one another to do this, right? Show how much of a man you are by just lying in the middle of the road. And they start putting pressure on each other. And so these people are then faced with a choice. Do I conform and lie down in the middle of the road while these cars are whipping by and hope I don't get hit? Or do I not conform? And this tendency to want to conform is so strong that these people were willingly risking their lives, and in some cases it cost them their lives, simply to avoid the negative social consequences of not conforming. That's how strong this tendency is to want to conform our behavior, to want to avoid these negative social repercussions to not conforming. And we certainly know there are lots of negative social repercussions to not conforming. I think, well, I'll get there in one second. But the motivation here, in contrast to informational influence, the motivation here is not to be accurate in your response, because you know you're giving an inaccurate response. Your motivation is to be liked, or at least to not be disliked by others. So if you take a look at something like Colin Kaepernick, so he was in the news a little while ago for kneeling during the national anthem, right, at the beginning of football games. Now, he didn't make anyone else kneel or anything. He was just doing it as his own form of protest against police brutality against Black men, mostly. And yet, what happened is he faced a lot of pushback from other people. And I think that one of the main reasons, or one of the reasons in any case, why he faced that pushback is because these other people didn't like the fact that he wasn't conforming to their social rules about how you're supposed to behave during the national anthem. So even though he wasn't telling other people to do it, other people got offended that he wasn't following the rules, that he wasn't conforming to their standards. And so there's these negative social consequences that occurred as a consequence. But we can also look at this more experimentally to show that there are these negative social repercussions. And so this is a study that wanted to look at that. They wanted to look to see how people treated other people who didn't conform to their ideas of how they should behave. So what participants did in this study was in groups of, I think it was about 7 people or so. They discussed the case of Johnny Rocco. Now, Johnny Rocco is a juvenile delinquent, okay? And he had recently gotten in trouble for something or other, I don't know, vandalism or something. And what your role is as a participant in this discussion group is to figure out what sort of punishment does Johnny Rocco deserve for this crime that he committed. And maybe you think he could just get a warning, or he should get a fine, or he should go on probation, or he should be arrested and go to jail, or something like that, right? You have a whole bunch of options of what the appropriate punishment for Johnny Rocco should be. Now, importantly, though, in this discussion of 7 people, the researchers had 3 of those 7 people as confederates. In other words, people who were pretending to be participants, but in fact were working for the experimenter. So within each group, there was, first off, someone that we're going to call the mode. The word mode is a statistical term that simply means the most common response. And so what the mode is someone who agreed with the most common response that the participants actually gave. They agreed with the group majority. So if the majority of people within the group wanted a fine, then the mode wanted a fine as well. If the majority of people wanted jail time, then the mode agreed and wanted jail time. So you can think of the mode as someone who's conforming to what everyone else wants. Okay. The second type of confederate was someone called the deviate. And the deviate was the exact opposite of the mode. The deviate's role was simply to disagree with the group majority. So if the majority of people wanted jail time, the deviate wanted just a warning, for instance. And the third type of confederate was what's called the slider. The slider is someone who initially disagreed with the majority. So they were basically like the deviate at the beginning. But over the course of group discussion, they came to change their mind and they came to agree with the group majority. So they started like the deviate, ended like the mode, basically. After this group discussion, all 7 participants were separated, and the real participants were given questionnaires that asked them things like, how much would you want to do another study like this? Which of these people would you like to be in your group? Which would you like to kick out? How do you like the other people in your group? That sort of thing. What the researchers showed is that these participants, they really liked the people who conformed. They liked the people who agreed with them. So they liked the mode because the mode already agreed with them. They actually really liked the slider because the slider initially started out by disagreeing, and then over the course of discussion, they saw the error of their ways and they came to agree with me. My persuasive arguments were so persuasive, I convinced this person. Kind of like that, right? And so they liked the slider, they liked the mode. They hated the deviate. They wanted to kick the deviate out. They didn't want to work with the deviate. They wanted the deviate to leave. In other words, we like people that conform. We don't like people that don't conform. So showing the negative social repercussions that exist when people don't conform their behavior to what's expected. Okay? So we know that these negative social repercussions exist, and therefore we conform our behavior to avoid them preemptively. We can also look at various factors that affect conformity. And so, for instance, in the Ash study, he manipulated a few factors to look to see whether conformity would be greater or lesser than under certain conditions than others. And so one of the factors that he manipulated was the size of the group. In other words, how many other people were also at the table with you who were giving the same incorrect answer? And would the number of people who were there affect your likelihood of conforming? And what he showed is that conformity increases with the number of people in the group until you get to about 5 people or so. After that point, it doesn't much matter if there's 5 people or 6 people or 10 people or 20 people that are all doing the same thing. You're kind of maxed out your level of conformity. And so you can look, he graphed, for instance, the percentage of conforming judgments. This is how frequently people conformed, basically, as a function of how big the group was, how many other Confederates there were that were giving the same incorrect answer. And what he shows, as you can see in this graph, is that conformity increases. You went from 1 person to 2 people to 3 people to 4 people to 5 people. It increased, the likelihood of conforming increased as the number of people increased, and then it pretty much levels off after that point. Okay, so group size matters to some degree, but only really up to a certain point. A factor that seems to matter more than simply the number of people that are engaged in the behavior is whether those other people are unanimous in their behavior. Okay, so this factor is unanimity. In other words, do all of those other people, are they all engaged in the same behavior? Do they all agree with one another? So one thing that Ash manipulated in different variations of his study was that in some variations, he had another person who gave the right answer. So in the version of the study that I described to you, all those other people, all the Confederates were unanimous. They all gave the same wrong answer. In some variations, he would have one single other person who gave the right answer, right? So by the time it gets to you, 4 people gave the same wrong answer, 1 person has given the right answer. And he wants to see if you're likely to conform under that condition. What he showed is that a single dissenter, a single person who goes against the other people, a single person who gives the right response, drastically reduces conformity. And this matters much more than group size. So for instance, a consistent unanimous group of 3 people is likely to get you to conform. If you then take a group of, let's say, 20 people, 19 of whom give the wrong answer and 1 person who dissents, that drastically reduces conformity, even if the group size is really, really large, right? Just having one other person that you can share that experience with, that has also given that right answer, drastically reduces conformity. This is something you sort of see in the famous movie 12 Angry Men. This is a movie where there's 12 people, basically jury members. They're discussing in the jury room whether a defendant is guilty of his crime. And when they initially start at the beginning of the movie, 11 people think he's guilty and 1 person thinks he's not guilty, who's Henry Fonda. And then over the course of the movie, it's all about the arguments they're giving each other, and Henry Fonda slowly gets people over to his side as he convinces them. The presence of that 1 person, of Henry Fonda's character, the 1 person who went against everybody else, sort of gives everyone else permission to not conform as well. In fact, you might have seen this in your classes. I see this like almost every semester when I have in-person classes. When I have an assignment due, what happens is if I get to class, say 10 minutes early, I've got a bunch of students who are already in class and everyone's holding on to their assignment. No one's really doing anything. And then 1 person walks up to the front of the room and turns in their assignment. And all of a sudden the floodgates open and everybody walks to the front of the room and turns in their assignment. What happened there? You had 1 dissenter, 1 person who wasn't conforming, who turned in their assignment, and that gave permission to everybody else to not conform as well. Or another situation, I've seen this a lot, is let's say you are watching a play or a concert or something like that. And let's say it's a play. And then the scene ends and the curtain comes down and you go to clap and no one else is clapping. Are we clapping? Is it ready to clap yet? And then 1 person claps and all of a sudden applause breaks out all over. Right? Now what's happened there is that, well, it's hard to start clapping when no one else is because you'd have to break conformity, right? So we're not quite ready to until 1 single person starts clapping and all of a sudden applause breaks out. It allows everyone else to not conform as well. So 1 dissenter drastically reduced conformity. In other words. Second factor that affects conformity is a third factor that affects conformity is group cohesion, or how tight the group is, how much they like each other. A highly cohesive group is composed of people who like each other. And what studies have shown is that cohesive groups, or important groups, groups of people that we like, results in more conformity, which sort of makes sense, because in a group of people that you like, we care more about what they think about us. And so we really are sort of uncomfortable not conforming with a group of people that we already like, because we want them to think highly of us. So we're more likely to conform as a consequence. And this finding is going to be really important in a few weeks when we discuss group processes. Because what we're going to see is that under some conditions, groups can make really, really disastrously bad decisions. And part of the reason they do that is because they start conforming to one another, because these tight-knit groups result in high levels of conformity. And no one's questioning the wisdom of the group. And as a consequence, they end up making really, really bad decisions, as we're going to see. Finally, there's a number of factors related to the person themselves that makes them more or less likely to conform. So for instance, we've already mentioned how culture matters. So people from Eastern cultures are more likely to conform than people from Western cultures, in part because conformity is thought of as kind of a good thing in Eastern cultures and kind of a bad thing in Western cultures. We looked at self-monitoring before in this class. Self-monitoring, if you recall, is the tendency to look to our social environment to see how we should behave. So high self-monitors are people who are always scanning their environment, figuring out how they should behave in that situation. As a consequence, high self-monitors conform a lot. But low self-monitors are people who are not scanning their social situation to figure out how they behave. They're consistent across all situations. As a consequence, low self-monitors do not conform very much. Finally, self-esteem matters as well. So people who have high self-esteem are more comfortable not conforming. So people with high self-esteem are less likely to conform than people with low self-esteem who don't have high enough self-esteem to avoid conforming. So they're more likely to go along with what people want. Okay. So there are a number of factors that affect our likelihood of conforming. But kind of the main takeaway of this section is that conformity is surprisingly common, even among people in Western cultures where we don't like to think we conform. People conform all the time. And they do so because conforming either out of informational influence, so they want to engage in the correct behavior, or because of normative influence, where they want to avoid the negative social repercussions associated with not conforming. Okay. Before I move on, are there any questions that I can address right now? Is anyone still with me? I see no videos and no one's in the chat. I hope I'm not talking to myself. Okay, I got a couple people at least. That's good. Okay. If there's nothing here, and I think conformity is relatively straightforward, so it's not surprising there aren't many questions here. So let's go on to a second topic. People don't like non-conformers, but are easily influenced by just one. I'm not quite sure what you're asking me there. It's not that, I'm not sure if you're talking about dissenters. If so, the appropriate way to think about it is not that they're affected by the one dissenter, it's that the one dissenter means they aren't influenced by the other people who are conforming. I'm not quite sure if that's what you're asking me. So if it's not, then feel free to follow up with a question. Okay, in the meantime, as I mentioned, we're going to be talking about social influence in general. And so conformity is just one type of social influence. What I'm going to do is ramp up the amount of social influence just a little bit. So what we're going to talk about for the remaining 15 minutes or so, and then into next lecture, is persuasion. Persuasion's a little bit different than conformity, because when we're talking about persuasion, we're talking about people's deliberate attempts to change people's attitudes. So again, with conformity, we saw that we'll conform even if people aren't putting any pressure on us to conform. But now we're talking about people who are putting pressure on others, in particular to change their attitudes. Just reading the question here. So they're more offended by the fact that the non-conformer is not being a sheep as well. I'm not sure what you mean by offended. Conformity occurs, regardless of being offended by anything. They are, if what you mean is they are definitely influenced by a single non-conformer. They're influenced, that just having that single other person there gives them permission, in a sense, to not feel like they need to conform to everybody else. When we talk about persuasion, we're going to talk about how one of the general tendencies, again, this is something we've also seen before in this class, and again, that we'll see again, is that we have a tendency to behave sort of mindlessly. Remember, we don't like to think a lot, right? That's why we rely on heuristics and biases. That's part of the reason why we engage in the fundamental attribution error. So that's why I've titled this lecture with the word mindlessness, is because we're going to see that people behave sort of mindlessly. And because we behave mindlessly, because we don't like to think a lot, what that means is that we are very easily influenced by different techniques and different strategies that people have to try to manipulate us. As a consequence, the people who know social psychology know how to manipulate other people and take advantage of this tendency for you to behave mindlessly. And so hopefully one of the purposes that I have of this lecture, one of the goals, is that you can understand how people try to take advantage of you, so that when people try to persuade you, you can hopefully have some sort of defenses up, right? You can realize that people are trying to take advantage of you. ELM, by the way, is short for elaboration likelihood model. I'm going to talk about that in just a few slides. We're going to see it's sort of a theoretical model of persuasion that we're going to talk about in just a minute. But when we talk about persuasion, we're talking, as I said, we're talking about people's attempts to change your attitudes. And you see all sorts of persuasion attempts, probably hundreds every day, in the form of, for instance, ads. And so you'll have ads that try to change your attitude, try to get you to develop a positive attitude towards whatever they're selling. So in this case, it's a car, right? Or it could be a restaurant, or whatever product they're selling. These are all attempts to persuade you to buy their product. Now, remember, the idea here is that if they can change your attitude towards their product, well, if attitudes are related to behaviors, which, as we saw earlier, they are under the right circumstances, then if you develop a more positive attitude towards their product and you behave consistently with that, you're more likely to buy their product. This is an ad for smoking. Smoking, I always thought, those ads are always interesting to me because the people in the ads are never using the product. So like these people are swimming, which has absolutely nothing to do with smoking. In fact, if anything, it would be really hard to smoke while you're swimming, right? But I think there's reasons they're not showing people smoking. I imagine there's legal reasons for that. But I find it always interesting, those sorts of ads. There is one other type of ad that does that as well, and those are ads for erection pills, like Cialis. Obviously, for obvious reasons, they can't show people having sex in the ads. So they're always doing other things. Like sometimes I've seen ones where they're hiking through the woods, which seemed weird to me because if anything, it'd be really hard to hike if you had an erection. It's sort of strange. And this ad drives me nuts because these people are in his and her bathtubs. So I guess what this means is these people have like some sort of cabin or something where they have these tubs that they dragged out onto a hill, which they had to fill with water. There's no plumbing. So they had to fill it like a bucket of water at a time, which means by the time they're in the bathtubs, they're sitting in like cold water. And then this is an ad for an erection pill, and yet they're in different tubs, which seems strange as well. So anyway, these commercials or these ads are always very odd to me for various reasons. But regardless, they are attempts to change people's attitudes. Or we can have ads that are directed towards changing health behaviors, such as getting vaccinated, which is going to be really important in the upcoming months. Okay, this is a famous persuasion attempt. This was Rosie the Riveter during World War II, when a lot of the men were fighting overseas and they needed women to take up jobs in the US. They had campaigns that were trying to change women's attitudes towards taking on full-time jobs. There's also propaganda falls under the rubric of persuasion as well. This is a type of propaganda that was used, I believe, among US soldiers. Again, I think it's during World War II, where the idea was they didn't want soldiers to not be able to fight because they got gonorrhea and syphilis and other sexually transmitted diseases. So they would have ads like this to try to dissuade them from sleeping with prostitutes and things like that. And if we're going to talk about propaganda, then we're going to talk about Adolf Hitler and Nazi Germany, sort of masters of propaganda. And like this poster shows right here, where the attempt is to show Hitler as basically being ordained by God, right? With the lights like streaming down behind him, as if God himself has ordained him to be the leader of the world. These are attempts to change people, in this case, the German people's attitudes towards the Nazis. Okay, so we're talking about deliberate attempts to change other people's attitudes. As I alluded to a minute ago, we're going to see that a lot of the ways in which we respond to persuasion attempts are driven by mindlessness. Now, not always. There are some conditions under which we can think in depth about a message that we're getting, but under a lot of circumstances, as I said, we behave sort of mindlessly because we don't really like to think very much. And I want to describe a couple studies that show this tendency to behave mindlessly, meaning we tend to make decisions without really thinking through everything, without a whole lot of careful thought. And what that means is that we're not really thinking in depth about something. If we're not engaged in a lot of careful thought, we're often persuaded by relatively unimportant variables. And so I'll describe to you a famous study from the 70s that looked at this. This was a study that was done by a woman by the name of Ellen Langer. And what she did is, at a university library, she basically disabled all the photocopiers in the library except for one. So what happened is a lot of people needed to photocopy things. And so this long line started to form behind this one photocopier. Now, what she wanted to see is whether she could get people to cut in front of other people in line by persuading them to let them in. So here's what she did. She had some research assistants go to different people in line and try to cut in under one of three conditions. Okay, these are the three conditions here. So what we're going to look at is the percentage of people who agreed to let this person cut in front of them. And we'll do this by condition. So we'll start with this no excuse condition. So people in this condition, the research assistants, would go up to a random person in line and say, "Excuse me, can I cut in front of you?" They would ask them what they wanted, and they gave no excuse for why they needed to cut in front of them. Now, the people that were in line were actually quite nice, because the majority of them, about 60%, let the person cut in front of them, even if they didn't have an excuse for why they wanted to do that. Okay, the second condition was an excuse condition. So the research assistants would try to cut in front of people in line by saying, "Excuse me, can I cut in front of you? I'm in a rush." Okay, well, "I'm in a rush" is an excuse of why they're cutting in front of them. It seems to be a valid excuse. And so as a consequence, what you see is, as you would expect, the rate at which people agreed to let this person cut in front of them jumped to, like, I think it's about 94% or so. Okay, there's nothing surprising about this, right? You give people an excuse, a good excuse, and they're more likely to comply. They're more likely to let this person cut in front of them. What's most interesting, though, is this third condition. Because what people did in this condition is they would try to cut in front of people by saying, "Excuse me, can I cut in front of you? I need to make some copies." Now, if you think about this for 2 seconds, you realize that this is a garbage excuse, right? Because obviously you need to make copies. Everyone needs to make copies because you're in line for a photocopier. So there's no value to this excuse at all. It's completely an empty excuse, right? And so you'd expect that logically, if people were really evaluating the content of the excuse, well, this empty excuse is effectively no excuse. So you'd expect about 60% of people to agree to let that person cut in front of them, but that's not what you find. What you find is that 93% of people agreed in this condition. Basically identical to the people who gave an actual valid excuse. I'm in a rush. Now, why would that happen? Well, think of it this way, right? So when someone asks you for a favor, it's kind of like the only thing we hear is, hey, can you do this for me? Because blah, blah, blah. And it doesn't matter what the justification is, because that's just too much for us to think about. We don't want to think about it. As long as you ask me to do something and it has the form of an excuse, we don't even process what the excuse actually is. As a consequence, even this garbage excuse, this empty excuse, is still adequate to convince people to let them cut in front of them, because people aren't thinking about the content of the excuse, because they're behaving mindlessly, right? So this is sort of a famous study that demonstrates that we will behave mindlessly under some conditions. This is another study. What the researchers did is they simply asked people on the street for money, and they did so in one of two ways. So they did so in either a typical way, so they would say, excuse me, can you spare a quarter? Or they would do so in an atypical fashion. Excuse me, can you spare 37 cents? Or in some conditions, it was, can you spare 17 cents? And at the end of the day, they simply counted up how much money they made using one of these two conditions. And what they find is that people who are asked an atypical question end up giving more money, or are more likely to give money, than people who are asked a typical question. Why is that the case? Well, chances are, if you've been walking on the street downtown or something, you've been approached by, let's say, a homeless person who asks you for money, and they might say something like, can you spare a quarter? And you might have been asked this so many times that you have sort of this automatic response that you give. Sorry, I don't have any money. Sorry, I don't have any money. It's automatic response, right? So in this typical condition, someone asks you, can you spare a quarter? Sorry, I don't have any money. But now imagine someone comes up to you and changes it a little bit and says, excuse me, can you spare 37 cents? You don't have an automatic response to that because you've never been asked 37 cents before, right? It gets you thinking a little bit more. Well, maybe they need exactly 37 cents for whatever it is they need. It gets you thinking about the nature of the request. Or in other words, it breaks you out of your mindless responding. And by breaking you out of your mindless responding and your sort of mindless tendency to say, I don't have any money, that makes it more likely that you're going to comply and give them money. Okay? So what this is showing then is that breaking people out of their mindlessness gets them to be more likely to be persuaded. Okay, I am going to stop things there. So we'll pick up there on Tuesday. So again, just to remind you one more time, if you haven't already, go to the assignment section in Canvas and you should see assignment 1 there. Download it, make sure you get that turned in by Thursday at 3:30. Okay? All right, guys, have a great weekend. I will see you next week. Bye.